out of the blocks, the Minister has sent out an email to all MPs, all senators, all MPs and senators' staff, urging them to watch out for charities that might be in breach of this new legislation and asking them to report on them immediately if they think charities or others are involved in political activity.
So to dob in a charity, essentially.
Well, I call it this, Eb. It's dob in a do-gooder.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to talk about a little-known piece of legislation the government and opposition rammed through the Parliament that you've probably never heard of. There was a regulation that would have allowed the Charities Commissioner extraordinary and far-reaching powers to deregister charities for the most minor of offences, but that regulation was disallowed in the Senate. This is an entirely different piece of legislation called the Electoral Legislation Amendment or Political Campaigners Bill 2021. The last-minute amendments to the bill were rushed through the Parliament, and they now threaten to mire the Australian charity sector in red tape and restrict important advocacy.
I will now deal with the Electoral Legislation Amendment Political Campaigners Bill 2021. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no.
One of the things that has come up as a bit of a surprise is a move that really puts incredible pressure on charities to declare themselves as political campaigners, and that's going to have a huge impact, particularly, I think, in the area of environmental charities.
But Labor will support measures around transparency and having groups like Climate 200 declare their donors, so those laws will get through.
That charity will have to register as a political campaigner, which restricts from where you can get money and increases the paperwork burden.
Scott Morrison is trying to silence charities. He's trying to stop us all from doing advocacy work. He's trying to silence civil society. He's trying, as he heads into the next election, to make sure that charities cannot hold him accountable for policy failures and call him out for things that need to change.
So I'm delighted to introduce the Australia Institute's Executive Director, Ben Oquist, to explain exactly what happened and what's at stake. G'day, Ben. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Ebony.
So, Ben, to begin with, why are you so concerned about this legislation in the first place?
Well, I think it's good to go back a step, Eb. In 2018, the government introduced what controversial laws at the time. They created amendments to the Electoral Act that classified certain organisations as political campaigner organisations. Organisations that incurred electoral expenditure of over $500,000 were deemed to be political campaigners, and once they'd reached that threshold, they had a whole raft of new obligations put on them. It was controversial legislation at the time.
Mm-hmm. The Australian government's statements here on the world stage and its actions at home and the sustained pressure that it is placing on the charities, the community groups and the institutions that hold it to account. The Australian government recently introduced a package of new laws which would suffocate the public voice of civil society groups, create sweeping new secrecy.
But it was amended after thorough consultation with the industry to take out a lot of the worst bits of it.
Yep.
So that was done in 2018. Now, fast forward to 2021, the government's introducing new amendments to that legislation with no Senate inquiry. It came out of an obscure recommendation from the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters with almost zero public debate that really expanded who would be captured in that organisation. At its heart, what it does is turn organisations that are pursuing legitimate advocacy, trying to convince the public or politicians to change policy, and turns their activity into electioneering. and classifies it as that, and then brings forward a host of new regulations associated with it. So at its heart, if you think about it this way, obviously when a candidate or a politician is going to an election and trying to get elected, there's certain requirements on them and how they operate.
And we want to know who's donating to them and all that kind of stuff.
All that sort of stuff. There's quite detailed regulations about what sort of advertising has to be lodged with the Commission and authorisation that has to be put in place. There's bans on election advertising after a certain date in election campaign, as you say. Transparency, although as weak it is around how much donations have to be declared, all sorts of rules and regulations that run election campaigns.
But that's not what charities are engaged in.
No, and what at its heart this bill does, and the previous bill, is seeks to conflate those two things, legitimate political advocacy with electioneering by candidates and the specific regulations and rules you have for them. And what the government is really doing is entrapping legitimate advocacy by charities under the Electoral Act.
Over the years, we've learned that sometimes charities like us need to speak up.
If charities were prevented from speaking up, our country would be a poorer place.
Advocacy gives people a voice, it holds government to account, and it secures a better Australia.
But right now, the federal government is trying to silence our charities. Silence you.
Right now, laws are being changed to silence charities and avoid accountability.
Hands off our charities.
Hands off our charities.
Hands off our charities.
So I just want to go through the process, because while a lot of people know kind of what Parliament spits out the other end when we change a law, they might not know how exactly a law gets passed. So can you just walk me through what was unusual about the way this was pushed through the Parliament?
Well, as I said, back in 2018, legislation was passed, set up this new regime that captured organisations and turned them into political campaigners under certain circumstances. So, for example, Get Up, back then after that legislation became a political campaigner organisation and had new reporting requirements, but didn't capture too many other organisations. That regime seemed to be working well. Wasn't an uproar in the community about it needing to be strengthened or loosened. I don't think it was perfect. It had its warts, but it existed. So come forward on the eve of the election, as we are now in 2021, the government brings amendments forward to that legislation with almost no public debate, no Senate inquiry into them. Normally, any piece of legislation, amending an existing piece of legislation, would go to a Senate inquiry, almost anything, no matter how big or small.
And what happens at a Senate inquiry for people who aren't familiar?
Well, the good thing about a Senate inquiry is that the issues get percolated in the public debate. The public and organisations are invited to make submissions to a Senate committee, and that leads to a public debate and discussion about how the legislation will actually work. And these issues can be teased out both technically, but also importantly to the public and the public debate. We didn't have any of that this time.
Yeah.
Instead, we had these amendments brought into the Parliament at the last minute and rammed through both houses of Parliament that significantly changed the Electoral Act in how it treats charities in certain circumstances and their ability to advocate free from a massive burden of red tape.
Yeah. And so during that normal Senate inquiry process, if you're a charity that's going to be negatively impacted, you could make a submission and you might be invited to go along and say, we don't think this works because it'll impact us this way. But in this case, there was really, you're saying, no consultation with the charity sector whatsoever.
No, and let's go back to that 2018, that controversial legislation that was passed. It was an enormous consultation from both sides of politics with the charity sector, and in the end, a compromise bit of legislation was passed. This time, not only no Senate inquiry, but no consultation from either side of politics about what would be a fair compromise, if indeed there needed to be one.
Yeah.
I mean, back to first principles, no one had run a coherent case for why we needed these amendments. There wasn't big speeches from the Prime Minister about it. There wasn't consultation. There wasn't a public debate. There wasn't press conferences from the Special Minister of State about why. So, in a sense, the public was kept in the dark and the charities were hoodwinked.
And just how big is the charity sector, Ben, in Australia?
Well, this is the thing. Normally, legislation that goes through the Parliament back to your point about talking about the process, that affects a big section of the population or a big section of industry, of course, will be consulted. If there's legislation being proposed that affects the mining industry or the retail industry or the hospitality industry, you can imagine the level of consultation that goes on with them in the lead-up, usually, to the legislation. But then once it's introduced, a lot of consultation. But even though the charity sector, by a 2017 report by Deloitte, estimates that it employs directly 140,000 people or more and is worth $129 billion to the Australian economy, even though the charity sector is that big. Now, get your head around those figures. $129 billion a year industry, 20 times as big as the coal mining industry in Australia, employing 850,000 people, roughly the size of the retail industry. Even though the charity sector is that big, there's no consultation, there's no Senate inquiry, and legislation is rammed through.
Instead of supporting the 59,000 charities that employ 1.3 million Australians, that provide 22.2 million hours of volunteer-free work to the community, that got people through COVID and the bushfires, instead of helping them, he's assaulting them by trying to pass a new regulation that would result in charities being able to be deregistered for sharing, for example, a TikTok video encouraging you to go to a peaceful protest.
So, Ben, the Special Minister of State, you mentioned he didn't really put forward the case ahead of this legislation coming, but it seems like he's out of the blocks now that it has passed Parliament. And The Guardian has written an article about what he's done next. What has the Special Minister of State done in the wake of this legislation?
Well, the legislation has passed, a little public debate, no Senate inquiry, no consultation, and out of the blocks, the Minister has sent out an email to all MPs, all senators, all MPs and senators' staff, urging them to watch out for charities that might be in breach of this new legislation and asking them to report on them immediately if they think charities or others are involved in political activity.
So to dob in a charity, essentially.
Well, I call it this, Eb. It's dob in a do-gooder. That's the approach that the minister has taken. Well, most of us think charities are one of the great kind of gifts to our society, both in the services they provide and the advocacy they undertake. Instead, you've got a government rushing through legislation to nobble them, tie them in red tape, and then urge MPs, senators and their staff to dob them in, to dob in do-gooders.
To help those who are hungry, who are desperate, who have fled war and conflict.
On climate change and demanding climate change action.
To increase dignity, reduce poverty and save lives.
We protect the air that we breathe and the water that we drink, and we've helped create national parks.
Health, education, disability, overseas aid, on lots of topics.
So we just make the world a better place.
Unfortunately.
And so where charities might fall afoul of this is, as you say, that difference between policy advocacy and election campaigning. So if you're a charity that provides homelessness services, you might also want to be advocating for or against policies that either fix or create homelessness. And that's just kind of the everyday work of a charity. And now the risk is that that's going to be seen as election campaigning and oppose this whole new regime of red tape on charities. Is that essentially what we're talking about?
That's right. I mean, the government has changed the threshold by which a charity might be caught up in this new red tape quagmire. And it's not just red tape. A certain international philanthropy would be curtailed by an organisation once it's caught up in this regime. And, of course, it relies upon a definition of what electoral expenditure is that is not completely nailed down about what that is. And if you're advocating strongly for policies during an election campaign period and spending money doing so, advocating for policy change in election context, there's now a real risk that you could fall foul of these laws.
So, for example, if you are a pro-life organisation opposed to the Northern Territory's euthanasia private members bill that was coming in to allow the NT to legislate for euthanasia again, and you were running a big campaign that just happened to be in a federal election year, you could maybe get caught up now in a way where the definition used to mean that if it was genuine advocacy, the dominant purpose isn't to ask voters to vote one way or another, but to lobby politicians around a piece of legislation. Those two things used to be different, and now the risk is they're all just conflated together.
Yes, and it's a bit technical, but the definition of electoral expenditure in the first instance is meant to be expenditure incurred for the dominant purpose of creating or communicating electoral matter. But once you're captured in this regime, there's a new definition introduced, totally undefined, about anything related to an election. And really, we don't know what that includes.
Yeah.
I mean, does that mean talking about a policy during election campaign, commenting on it, surveying your members about it and the cost of that? So it's a whole new world awaits any organisation that falls foul and gets trapped in this legislation.
The legislation being put through the Parliament at the moment is going to radically change that.
It will have a chilling effect on advocates right across civil society.
It'll affect our capacity to speak out on behalf of those who need our voice.
They need their issues put before decision makers in the Australian Parliament.
To actually gag Australian charities is massive overreach.
Australia would be a much poorer place if the voices of charities and civil society more broadly were silenced.
Back one step, I mean, the government's argument is this is all in the interests of transparency and accountability, that if political parties have to meet certain rules, standards and regulations, then so should other people that are involved in an election campaign. Now, of course, this, as we've discussed, this is completely misconceived between, the difference between electioneering as a candidate or a politician and the legitimate right to free speech and advocate those charities' role. But I think it's important to step back and think about a couple of things here. We have a massive community debate about the integrity of our political system and a huge public outpouring of wanting a federal anti-corruption watchdog. The government has failed in 3 years to bring forward legislation that would increase accountability and integrity in our parliament by an ICAC legislation. Yet in 3 hours, they rushed through legislation that impacts $120 billion plus industry and its right to advocate. So it just tells you that something is amiss here. If the government was serious about increasing integrity and accountability in politics, it wouldn't have sat on the issue of a federal ICAC for 3 years and then rushed this bill through in 3 hours.
Yeah, might have started with getting its own house in order.
Mr. Speaker, we have waited too long for an integrity commission. I have watched scandal after scandal going uninvestigated with no independent watchdog on the beat.
Ben, is your concern now that this will just have the effect of silencing charities who don't want to fall afoul of this new cumbersome legislation?
There's no doubt it will have a chilling effect because it's not clear how the amendments are actually going to work, and they're open to interpretation. Different legal advice is being sought by different charities, but there's no doubt that some people will think, I don't want to fall foul of these laws. I don't want to go near them. I'll think twice about that advocacy or spending money on that advocacy if it could be seen to be electioneering or associated with an election. So it has a chilling effect even before anybody falls foul of it, and that's the real worry. I mean, we need at the moment to be finding ways to strengthen our democracy, to allow more people to get into our democratic debates. As you know, Eb, we've talked about it before. There's a real loss of trust in politics and in democracy, not just in Australia but around the world. It's a global issue, from China to the riots in Washington to the disillusionment of Australia in politics. We can't take our democracy for granted. And hobbling those who are trying to participate in it from the charity sector and have a voice is the last thing we should be doing. We need more community involvement, not less. And this is going to have a chilling effect.
And I just find it really interesting because often charities are really the advocates of some of the most vulnerable and marginalised in the communities, whether that's people who work on human rights campaigns or, in the past have stood up for the rights of LGBTIQ community, HIV/AIDS campaigners, animal rights activists. But it is a really important role that charities play, speaking up often on behalf of those who are marginalised from that federal debate.
Yeah, this is the worrying thing. Charity sector, we've talked about how big it is, you would imagine that an industry that big would be more powerful. But it's not, because it's so often representing the least powerful. And those voices don't have enough sway in our public debate. And this helps tilt the playing field even further against them. There's all sorts of things wrong with this legislation. It's retrospective. Organisations that weren't a political campaigner organisation at the time are now going to be audited backwards, and if they spend over the threshold, they're going to be brought into the legislation. So you might have been acting perfectly within the law as it stood in the last few years, but they've changed the threshold, and if you now spent money over the new threshold, you're going to be captured in this new red tape nightmare. So, retrospectivity is meant to be one of those great things that the conservative side of politics won't go near.
Yeah, they're quite opposed to it.
But when it came to the charity sector in this legislation, it was rammed through, unfortunately, with the support of both sides of politics.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, retrospectivity is certainly something that I think the Prime Minister and Attorney General and others have really discounted when it comes to talking about their model for a corruption watchdog, for example.
Yep.
That was one of the main things. But I just want to come back to some of the other problems with it. So the retrospectivity you've talked about. I think we've talked about the inconsistent treatment of what electoral expenditure means. You've touched on the loss of potentially international philanthropy, so people getting donations from overseas. I guess if you were to wrap it up, what are some of the problems that you've seen with the way this has, proceeded? There's like the right to privacy, as you've said, of people who've perhaps donated and now might be forced to disclose, those types of things. I mean, the process has just been a bit of a shambles by the sounds of it.
Well, completely. You've just touched on another one there that links those two issues of privacy and retrospectivity. Like, this legislation means that once you're registered as a political campaigner, or they've changed the definition of political campaigner to a third-party actor, words to that effect. But once you're caught in that, you have to, as an organisation, disclose all receipts you get, all values of gift in kind, details of receipts and debts greater than the threshold, total payments and total debts, total expenditure, and donations from certain individuals might have to be declared, even though those donations were given under previous law, but because the law is retrospective, that new threshold applies to the past, and a donor might find themselves caught up in this, really breaching their privacy as well.
This government has been trying to attack advocacy groups for as long as I've been the ACF CEO anyway, 7 years. And I think what they'll do next is limit people's ability to donate to groups like ACF because they've labelled us political campaigners. So this bill is bad, but what comes next could destroy our ability to speak up for koalas and forests.
And it's got really far-reaching effects on all sorts of organisations that we don't know it of yet. I said these amendments to the Electoral Act were introduced with no Senate inquiry and a passing reference at a joint standing committee in electoral matters. But it gets worse. The legislation had been introduced and was lying around undebated for a little bit. At the last minute, the government introduced a raft of new amendments to its own amendments, significantly widening its scope. And there was obviously no consultation on that because it was done at the last minute. And why they did that, and at the behest of whom, we have no idea. A shambles would be kind to the government, Eb. This was a deliberate, calculated hit on charities under the cover of the last days of Parliament. As you mentioned at the beginning, the public debate was kind of lost and no one really heard about it, partly because there'd been this other debate that was affecting charities, the regulations that were disallowed by the Senate. Congratulations, Senate and senators, for disallowing those regulations. And also another bit of legislation, the government's moves to introduce voter ID at elections.
Which is a big concern because obviously in the United States and elsewhere, voter ID laws have been traditionally used to disenfranchise minority groups like African Americans in the United States. But here in Australia, the concern was really for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voters, people experiencing homelessness, those types of things. But Ben, in that context, it sounds like there's a theme here developing with legislation that's really targeting charities.
Yeah, and targeting charities on the eve of the election and targeting people's democratic rights on the eve of the election. Now, yes, those ACNC regs you talked about at the beginning were disallowed, and yes, the voter ID legislation was essentially blocked by the Parliament when Labor and the crossbench indicated they weren't going to pass it. But the charity sector in relation to this bill was effectively thrown under the bus, and the opposition decided it was worth doing that deal so they could get the voter ID blocked. And now that legislation should be blocked. It was wrong. There was a big campaign against it. It's going to disenfranchise people. Those parallels, as you've indicated, with what's been happening in the US. Now, all that's good, but under the cover of that, and as an excuse to get those other bits of legislation blocked, this legislation was passed. And it tells a really important story about the importance of public debate. And because there wasn't a public debate, I think both the government and the opposition thought that the charities could be thrown under the bus and they wouldn't wear much political heat from it.
Yep.
The opposition got what they wanted, which was the blocking of the voter ID bill. The government got what it wanted, throwing the charity sector in a mire of red tape.
So the voter ID bill that Special Minister of State Ben Morrison was trying to get up, and which the Labor Party was concerned about, particularly in relation to the Northern Territory seat of Lingiari, is dead. This would have required you to show your driver's licence at the ballot box or some form of ID. I'm told this bill had to pass this year to get through in time for the election, but Labor will support measures around transparency and having groups like Climate 200 declare their donors, so those laws will get through.
So what happens next, Ben?
Well, we've got to get this legislation repealed. The Australian Institute's launched a new initiative asking people to sign on and get it appealed, and lobbying their politicians in an election period. And we have to raise the debate about this legislation, because without that, there won't be pressure for that repeal. And of course, if there's not enough public debate, the government will come forward with new regulations. That's the evidence that's happened between 2018 and now.
Yeah, they might come back with those ACNC regulations where the Charities Commissioner can just deregister a charity if someone linked to it is even suspected of committing minor infringements. It was quite far-reaching.
As you said, there's a theme here, Eb, and unless there's a push to get this bill repealed, unless there's some controversy about it, and unless politicians feel the heat about it, there's no reason to think the government won't come back for more.
With something worse even, perhaps.
Indeed.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much for joining me today, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Ebony.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 14th of December 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and to sign up to add your name to repeal the Political Campaigners Bill. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Ben Oquist is at Ben Oquist, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.